Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Dan Palazzolo, co-director, along with my colleague Terry Price, of the Gary L. McDowell Institute at the Jepson School of Leadership Studies. And we want to begin with a few words of welcome and a few words of thanks. So we wish to welcome all, including guests that are viewing on live stream, students, faculty, staff, alumni, members of the community, including students from several local high schools, members of the McDowell Institute Board of Advisors, and members of the Board of Trustees, and President Halleck, who is seated right in front. Thank you all for attending today's lecture. This is really a special occasion for several reasons. In addition to having the opportunity to hear from an outstanding speaker and one of the nation's leading voices for democracy, the event is co-hosted by several university partners. The broad interest expressed from across the campus reflects the depth and versatility of our speaker's scholarship and service. We saw this interest in action earlier today when a group of students from the Bonner Center for Civic Engagement and the McDowell Institute Student Fellows had the opportunity to interact with Dr. Allen in a seminar discussion. We're grateful to our seminar leaders of Student Fellows, Dr. Jess Flanagan, Professor of Leadership Studies, Philosophy, Politics, Economics, and Law, and Dr. Kevin Cherry, Associate Professor of Political Science, who moderated the seminar discussion this afternoon. The event has 3 additional hosts. Dr. Sandra Peart, Dean of the Jepson School, provides constant support of the McDowell Institute, and today we thank her and the organizing committee of the Jepson Leadership Forum for allowing us to partner with the forum. This year's speaker series entitled E Pluribus Unum, the Divisions Testing American Democracy, will include 5 additional lectures throughout the academic year, so please be on the lookout for those upcoming events. We are also grateful to partner with Dr. Sylvia Gale, Executive Director of the Bonner Center for Civic Engagement. The Bonner Center prepares students for lives of purpose and connects students, faculty, staff, and community stakeholders in social change efforts that value the knowledge and potential in our communities. Turning 20 this year, the CCE places deep value on civic learning and on preparing participants for sustainable action. Thanks also are due to Dr. Jennifer Kavanaugh, the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences, also a co-host, and Dr. Claudio Lopez-Gura, Associate Professor of Political Science and Philosophy, Politics, Economics, and Law. Dr. Lopez-Gura suggested that we arrange for his colleague to visit the University of Richmond. At the McDowell Institute, we depend on the support of numerous donors whose gifts make our programs possible. We would especially like to acknowledge the Pauley Family Foundation for its generous support. Finally, an event like this wouldn't happen without key staff members, including Shannon Best, Heidi Thompson, and Alexandra Byram, as well as our catering staff. We're thankful to all for their efforts and great attention to detail. So just a couple of quick program notes. Our speaker will talk for about 45 minutes or so, after which there should be some time for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I will ask one of our attendants, Zach or Nina, to bring you the microphone so that everyone can hear the question. We will conclude at 6 p.m. If by that time some have not had a chance to ask a question, you may continue discussion about the lecture immediately after in a reception in the lobby. During this time, Dr. Allen will also be signing copies of her book, Justice by Means of Democracy, which will be available for purchase in the entrance. And now, without further delay, I'd like to invite Dr. Thad Williamson, Professor of Leadership Studies, Philosophy, Economics, and Law, to introduce our speaker. Thad?
Good evening and welcome. It is my distinct honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Danielle Allen, the James Bryant Conant University Professor at Harvard University and Director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Dr. Allen is unquestionably one of the most accomplished and significant political theorists and political scientists of her generation. Her rich and varied work reflects deep knowledge and careful reading of critical texts, careful attention to the dynamics of everyday life and interpersonal interactions, and astute engagement with public policy and the social sciences. She's also an unusual academic, and she's committed to testing her ideas in the real world and then reflecting what she learns back into her theoretical work. I've used Dr. Allen's work in my courses here in the Jepson School almost every semester for the past decade to illustrate fundamental questions pertaining to justice and injustice, democracy and its absence, and both the cruelties and the promise of contemporary American life. Those books include the stunning Our Declaration concerning the Declaration of Independence, the profoundly moving and courageous family memoir, Cuz, and most recently, the subject of this evening's talk, Justice by Means of Democracy. As the fellow political theorist who also came through Harvard's Department of Government just a couple of cohorts behind Dr. Allen, I've turned to her work again and again over the years and found it both insightful and resonant. It is one of the joys of intellectual life to read a text as taking what might have been a passing thought or intuition or simply a puzzle in one's own mind and see that an author has taken a similar thought, developed it, worked it through, and presented it with crystal clarity. That is the experience I so often have when I read Dr. Allen's work, which I commend to you. In her most recent book, Dr. Allen moves to reset both our academic and our public conversations about justice and to put it on both fresher and firmer ground. This intervention cannot be more timely. Over 50 years have passed since Harvard philosopher John Rawls published a theory of justice, which for decades stood as the authoritative statement of liberal egalitarian political philosophy. Yet in so many ways, the real world has moved quite opposite the direction Rawls believed and hoped it would, a long evident fact that political theorists have only recently come to terms with. Professor Allen's recent work seeks, among other things, to reconnect our academic discussions with the realities of the world we live in, not in abandonment of commitments to freedom, democracy, and equality, but in their service. I'm so excited to hear what Dr. Allen has to say this evening, and I hope you are too. Please join me in welcoming Professor Danielle Allen to the University of Richmond.
All right, let's see, I should first of all make sure that's on. Yay, fantastic. And I'm going to sneak backwards. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Dr. I truly appreciate it. It's a real honor to be read by a colleague and to be taken so seriously by a colleague, so I'm very grateful to you. And I want to thank the directors of the McDowell Institute and the directors of the Bonner Center for Civic Engagement for organizing this, and my colleague, Claudio, Dr. Lopez Guerra, for the original invitation. We had a fantastic conversation this afternoon, myself and a set of about 25 students, and so it's just a real pleasure to be with all of you. That's the best part of the opportunity to visit a campus always, is the chance to engage with students. I am also grateful to all of you for making time to come out this evening. This is a very special privilege to have the chance to share the argument in my book, Justice by Means of Democracy, with you. It is rare for a political philosopher to actually get the chance to share an argument of political philosophy with a broad audience. I do a lot of talking. I spend a lot of time talking about policy, or sometimes even directly about the question of the structure of our institutions, democracy reform, and things like that. And to talk about political philosophy is a little different. It's a little tougher, more challenging for an audience. So I just want to thank you again all for giving me your time this evening. I am going to present a case to you about some fresh ways for us to think about the project of building a healthy society in the US, in our constitutional democracy in the years ahead. That case, though, starts with some stories. There are origins to the work and there are origins to the argument. And the first origin is my grandfather, J.P. Allen. He was a Baptist preacher in northern Florida and southern Georgia. And among other things, he was one of the founders of one of the first chapters of the NAACP in northern Florida in the 40s. As you all know, that was an exceptionally dangerous period of time for people doing advocacy work for civil rights. And so he was a person who was often told that something was impossible. For example, that social equality for African Americans in the South was impossible. And his response to that was, no, it's not. Not only is it possible, but it's also necessary. And so the question we should ask is how? How do we get there? How do we achieve that? Another part of the origin story goes back to my great-grandparents on my mother's side. So here you have two folks, Grace and Fred, who worked really hard to achieve the right to vote for women. So Fred marched with suffragettes on Boston Common in 1917 because Grace was actually having a baby at that time, and so wasn't available to participate in the cause that was great concern to her. She ended up as president of the League of Women Voters in Michigan in the 1930s. They too were often told that something was impossible. In their case, that women having the right to vote was impossible. And their answer to that was, again, no. Not only not impossible, but necessary. And so again, the question is how? And I'm fortunate that from these people, I inherited a deep love of democracy, of constitutional democracy, and a deep commitment to the view that empowerment is the bedrock for human thriving and well-being. That is what motivated them. The sense that human beings do best when they have the opportunity to shape their own lives, to take responsibility for their own lives, and also to participate in shaping our collective life through the institutions of self-government. Again, shaping our own lives and working together with others to shape our collective life. That picture of empowerment, again, was for them the bedrock for human thriving and well-being. That commitment flowed from them to later generations. On your left, you have my mom and dad, and then me in the corner, if you can spot me down there. It's a trip to the zoo, all right? And over here you have my aunt, Rosalind. And I introduce them because both my dad and my aunt carried forward that commitment to empowerment as the bedrock for human flourishing and well-being. But they had huge arguments about how to achieve that. The point here I was going to make, so they had this shared broad commitment of empowerment, but they actually came from completely opposite sides of the political spectrum in pursuing this. So there was this one crazy year in my youth, 1992, when my dad was running for Senate from Southern California as a Reagan Republican, and my aunt was on the ballot at the very same time for Congress for the Peace and Freedom Party in the Bay Area, so far left side of the political spectrum. And so we did have really quite amazing dinner table conversations. So you have to see there me like looking up, trying to make sense of it all. I mean, that was sort of what life was like. And my dad would make the case for market liberties, civic virtues. My aunt, on the other hand, making the case for public sector investments in all segments of society and experiments in living. She was also gay. She was one of the first people to get married when San Francisco produced marriage licenses and so forth. So they went really back and forth over questions economic, questions social, questions cultural. And I was just trying to make sense of it all. I knew I loved them both. I knew they were both committed to achieving well-being and flourishing for themselves, their families, for their communities. I understood that they both put empowerment at the center of that, and yet the debate was so strong and heated. So that was the context that shaped, in a sense, my own philosophical inquiry about justice, about democracy, about empowerment, about how these pieces fit together. Now, it's important that we all understand that we're all philosophers, every single one of us, which philosophers have always told us. Every little kid is a philosopher because philosophy starts with wonder. As Plato said, for this feeling of wonder shows that you are a philosopher, since wonder is the only beginning of philosophy. And Aristotle extended the idea. Human beings began to do philosophy, even as they do now, because of wonder. At first because they wondered about the strange things right in front of them, and then later advancing little by little because they came to find greater things puzzling. So I wondered about my dad and my aunt and their arguments. I tried to make sense of them, and it was hard. And I went to college and graduate school and started learning about political philosophy, and I encountered this figure, John Rawls, greatest English language political philosopher of the 20th century, widely acknowledged as such. But I read him, and it didn't all fit together. I wondered about some of his arguments. You'll know his arguments. He is the person who, importantly, argued that we could figure out what justice is by imagining a veil of ignorance. We let a veil fall over us that obscures to us our social position. Are we a man? Are we a woman? What race are we? What economic position do we have? We can't know any of that. We have to imagine not knowing that, and then we try to figure out what rules of the game for society would we consider fair if we don't know where we're going to end up in the society. And that produces a sort of agreement, a social contract that gives us the definition of justice. Now for him, that definition of justice also included in it respect for basic liberties. We'll come back to that. And also something he called the difference principle. This was the idea that when public policy decisions are made, they should always be to the advantage of those who are worst off in society. Now, this Rawlsian picture is very sophisticated and specific in its details, but it entered into the world of policymaking in a somewhat reduced form, really supporting a focus on redistributive policies. Okay, think sort of taxation and redistribution in order to achieve equity in the allocation of resources in society. They're putting it very crudely and roughly there. So the Rawlsian picture in all of its sophistication got boiled down into something that's become a kind of very familiar part of our policymaking landscape and apparatus. But as I read Rawls, I spotted some things in Rawls that honestly didn't make a lot of sense to me, and this is where the wonder kicked in. Rawls would sometimes say, for example, that in some historical situations or some historical limitations, there might be justifications for lesser political liberty, but there could never be justification for the loss of liberty of conscience or the rights defining the integrity of the person. So what does this mean exactly? What this means is, so when Rawls was asserting that justice starts from protecting basic liberties, there were two categories of liberty he was thinking about. Philosophers call these negative liberties and positive liberties. Negative liberties are freedoms from interference by the government. So freedoms of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom of association are conventionally put in the basket of negative liberties. Positive liberties are freedoms to participate in something. So the freedom to vote, the freedom to run for office, the freedom to play a role in shaping your own community. Okay? So negative liberties, freedoms from interference. Positive liberties, freedoms to participate in that project of empowerment I was describing. And Rawls's argument was that these things should be protected, but when it came down to it, when you read his work carefully, he was actually willing to sacrifice those positive liberties, to say they could sometimes be put aside. So he made these comments in thinking about, for example, the place of women in some societies. Should political liberty for women be pursued where they didn't have it? Not necessarily in his argument if the material conditions for justice, as he described them, weren't there. In other words, he suggested that people should prioritize economic and material outcomes over political liberties in some cases. Now, this, I'll be honest, came as a shock to me to hear this argument. Because remember, again, I came from people who put their life on the line in order to achieve empowerment, political liberty. My grandfather, working to found the NAACP, was pursuing voting rights. He was pursuing participation in the polity. Yes, there was a belief that full participation would also bring better material circumstances. But the very choice he was making was to put his life on the line for political liberties. So I wondered about Rawls. I wondered, how had he come to make this argument? And I wondered why he was so broadly influential when I saw a piece of the puzzle that he didn't seem to see. So the answer to why he was so influential and sort of where this comes from relates to the longer history of the tradition of liberal political thought. Now, when I refer to liberal political thought, I am not referring to political parties. Okay, I want to be just very clear about vocabulary. Liberal in this context of philosophy means protective of rights. All right? So the founders of this country were liberals. They cared to protect rights. Thinkers throughout the 19th century on both sides of the political spectrum were liberals because they cared to protect rights. Even in the context of the US in recent years, you think about the sort of 80s, 90s, and so forth, Reagan and Clinton, both liberals because they cared to protect rights. All right? So this is not about party politics. It's about a basic philosophical commitment. Now, That picture of protecting rights and that distinction between negative and positive liberties goes back to these two figures here, Benjamin Constant in the early 19th century, and then later Isaiah Berlin. Constant wrote a very famous essay on the liberties of the ancients and the moderns. He was contrasting freedom, the way the Greeks and Romans thought about it, with the freedom of the commercial society of the 18th and early 19th century. And his basic point was, well, the Greeks and the Romans, their freedom was about participation. It was that positive liberty. They liked to get out there in the agora in Athens, in the assembly, in the forum, and contribute to the decision-making for their society. But we moderns, he said, well, we just want to be left alone to make some money. All right? That's what freedom is for us. Thank you very much. I do not want interference, and I am too busy to participate in politics. Commercial opportunity is where it's at. That's the liberty of the moderns, Constant argues. And in an important way, he's not wrong, because the truth is, if you build up economic power, you actually also have political power. So pursuing economic power is a route to political power. So the concepts are not completely disconnected from each other, but there is a very different picture of how exactly people participate in their society. So Constant is really the person who pulled apart those two parts of liberty, negative and positive. And then Isaiah Berlin in the early 20th century gave those two concepts their names, negative liberties and positive liberties. Now, the importance of that then is that Rawls comes onto the stage and he says, I'm going to protect both categories of liberty. They both matter. But then he actually fails to achieve that protection of both categories in his theory of justice. And as I said, his work has woven its way into our policymaking, and I would argue has produced blind spots for our policymakers. And we feel the impacts of those blind spots by how we see the world of political experts and policymakers reacting to some recent events. So the 2008 Great Recession, the Trump election in 2016, and Brexit in 2020. Every one of those moments caught policymakers by surprise. They didn't necessarily catch ordinary folks, the rest of us, on the ground by surprise, but they all caught policymakers by surprise, okay? That means policymakers have some very significant blind spot that is blocking them from actually seeing what is going on in the world. And I want to suggest to you that the blind spot that policymakers have been suffering from is a focus on negative liberties, the idea that we just have to protect freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and support material advancement, and we can kind of forget about political liberties, all right? If we just do the first two things, then our policy will be okay. Now, what happens when you do that, if you forget about political liberties and asking the question of whether people have voice and agency and participation in decision-making, is you stop asking people their opinion, right? And it comes out directly then in how people do their policymaking work. Just to make this very concrete, the day after the 2016 election, I was sharing this with students earlier, I was on a panel, sort of panel at Harvard, one of those panels, sort of Noah's Ark panels, where you have to have a historian and a philosopher and economist. You have to have one of everything, right? And our job was to kind of digest and reflect on the implications of the election. Before the panel started, I was speaking to my economist colleague. I was the philosopher there for that panel. And he said to me, Danielle, we economists have always understood that globalization was going to take several decades to work its way through the economic systems of the globe and transform society. But, he said, I realized, watching this election season and watching the election last night, November 2016, that I had never once stopped to think about what 20 years of transformation of economic circumstances feels like to a person in a place living through it. That's the blind spot. A focus on positive liberties, on the expectation that people will contribute to shaping their communities and participate in policymaking to democracy robustly understood, avoids the emergence of that blind spot. And all of these cases, the Great Recession, Brexit, too, you can tell similar stories where people on the ground knew things that policymakers didn't know. all right? So in that case then, for me the question was, okay, I think Rawls's theory of justice has a problem. I think it doesn't, in fact, make political liberty non-sacrificable, and that is leading to a very bad and dangerous blind spot for how we think about policy. What happens if we instead try to build a theory of justice starting from the proposition that both negative and positive liberties are equally non-sacrificable? Okay? So this is where we get into the more technical, philosophical part of the conversation. Now, as I began to do this work, I did realize that there were some other philosophers out there in the landscape who had started to ask questions like this. So I won't spend a lot of time on them, but I just want to sort of tip my hat to philosophers who have been working in the direction that I'm trying to articulate here. Somebody named Amartya Sen, who originally from India, has developed something called capabilities theory, and really focuses on the intrinsic value of political liberties. He has made the important point that democracies around the globe have historically not experienced famines. And his account of the reason for this is because when an economic system goes out of whack such that it's in danger of not supporting a food supply adequately, in a democratic system, you have feedback loops that require policymakers to course correct and change direction and steer away from that economically problematic outcome. All right? So that's a key contribution from him. Philip Pettit, who has written a wonderful book called Just Freedom, which I would encourage you to take a look at. And he really focuses on the question of what does it mean to have a society where it's truly built around the idea that none of us dominate any of the rest of us, and we have institutions organized around that commitment to non-domination. And he suggests that we know we have that when we can pass the eyeball test, the tough luck test, and the straight talk test. The eyeball test is when all citizens can look each other in the eyes directly and not have one party needing to feel that they have to defer, look down in front of the other. When in policy debates, when the outcome of the debate emerges and it's clear that some have lost and some have won, the experience is that it's tough luck. Just didn't win this time. It's not that anybody is particularly out to get you. The process worked out. We went through our negotiations. We achieved a settlement. It was tough luck. The contestation will continue. We'll see who wins next time. Right? That's the sort of tough luck test. And the straight talk test is whether or not we are able to share our opinions freely and frankly with one another without fear of censorship. So those three tests are for him the markers of whether or not you've achieved a genuine society with true democracy, constitutional democracy, free from domination. Now, another one is Elizabeth Anderson, who was a student of John Rawls. I'm not going to go into her work at the moment, but what I want to point out is an interesting feature about these three philosophers. Sen, as I mentioned, came from India, so he was working in the context of post-colonial Britain. Okay, so somebody who experienced the nature of British colonial power and was trying to produce an alternative to it, recognizing the power of the liberal framework, but also recognizing the need for improvements. Philip Pettit from Ireland, okay? Same thing, recognizes the power of the liberal framework, but also recognizes the failures of British colonial administration and structure, and is trying to provide an alternative that moves past that. Elizabeth Anderson, a woman in the field of philosophy at a time when there were very few women in the field of philosophy, all right? So I would put myself, my grandfather, my great-grandparents in a similar bucket. People who have come from contexts where you can see in some sense the underside of a structure that's only partially respecting of rights, and where the job is to figure out how to make the political system fully respecting of rights, and again, in both categories, negative and positive liberties. And consistently, each one of us says, the first priority is actually political equality. Pull people into political equality, and then you have processes for decision-making that will deliver results that are fair and establish a foundation for flourishing. That's the basic idea. So what I offer in this book is, this is, a little A strange thing for a person to say really about their own book, but it's an attempt to offer a new paradigm, to invite us to take the move we've been marching over the last 200 years from classical liberalism in the late 18th, early 19th century to social democratic liberalism, early 20th, the neoliberalism, the last 50 years. And I'm offering you instead a picture of what I call power-sharing liberalism. I told you this was going to be an unusual talk. Not often, again, you sort of get presented a kind of political philosophy. Power-sharing liberalism. So what is this? This is a theory of justice that starts from the non-sacrificability of positive liberties. I also have an account about how this connects to some of the ideas of our founding in the Declaration of Independence, but I'm not going to talk about that right now tonight, but you are welcome to ask me about that if you'd like in the discussion. So why put political equality first? Let me go ahead and go back to my grandfather and great-grandparents' original question and give you an answer to that in a somewhat more philosophical form. So for starters, there's a set of propositions, okay, that stacked together yield the argument. The first proposition is that human beings are creatures who need to chart their own courses in life. They thrive on autonomy, the opportunity for self-creation and self-governance. This is similar to the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, okay? Human beings are creatures who need to chart their own courses in life. Now, this is the harder one. Given the necessary fact of diversity in all polities, there's always disagreement in every society. Citizens cannot exercise their autonomy only through private action. I can't simply direct my life in my own home and in my own commercial transactions and choices, all right? I live under rules that my community creates. For that to be something which I am helping to shape it, I have to have a participation role. The exercise of autonomy requires participation in civil society and political participation, right, for the reason I just articulated. Conditions of heightened diversity makes this theoretical point especially visible, right, because if the people who are making decisions are very different from me, I will feel that gap between the rules and my own, what I would like to contribute to it. So whenever we have a diverse society, that sense of the gap between collective decisions and our own position will be stronger. But this is a feature of all societies. And so giving us all the chance to achieve that steering of our own lives, again, requires that we participate in that messy sausage making where we try to combine our different perspectives, okay? So this is where the blind spot comes in. If we make a mistake and fail to see how important participation is in shaping our own communities and civil society, we'll have that 20th century blind spot that I was describing. So proposition 3, therefore the negative and positive liberties are equally non-sacrificable. I need those negative liberties to protect my private decision-making, steer my own life in my private context, and I need my positive liberties so that I can contribute to shaping my community. Okay. So what follows when you put political equality first? All right. Set of further propositions. Okay. There's a paradox for starters. When I protect negative liberties, freedom of association, freedom of property, I will get difference. All right? I will get people who marry, people who are like themselves, who form cultural groups, etc., and cultural groups that are distinguished from each other. I will get different allocations of property. Some will have more than others. Protection of negative liberties yields difference. The challenge in human life is that difference very often gets connected to or articulates with domination. That is just the human problem over and over again across time and space. So if we care to protect both batches of liberties, then we both want to celebrate the emergence of difference, but try to avoid its connecting to domination or becoming the basis for domination. When one group dominates another, that puts an end to political liberty for the group that's being dominated, okay? So if you're going to protect political liberty, you have to prevent domination from emerging in connection with difference. So this leads me then to a fourth proposition, that seeing positive and negative liberties as equally non-sacrificable requires recognizing another principle: difference without domination. Social difference, economic difference without domination. What on earth does that mean? How on earth do we do that? Okay, that's the hard question. So this is just a visualization to try to capture the basic philosophical approach here, all right? So I'm going to walk you through that, and then we'll get to some specifics about what it might mean to try to move forward with a commitment to difference without domination. The basic idea is that human moral equality is the foundation, the anchor point for thinking about justice, okay? So when I say we are all creatures who do best thrive through the ability to steer our own lives, that is a claim about human moral equality. That is how we are equal to each other in being creatures trying to chart a course through life, with nobody able to do that better for us than we can do for ourselves. Doesn't mean I'm great at it, but nobody else can do it better for me than I can do it for me, okay? And that's the kind of core of our equality. Now, if you're going to protect equality, that means protecting rights. It means protecting those two batches of rights I said. So up there you have negative rights and then positive rights, or negative liberties and positive liberties. Protecting both of those delivers political equality. And then the question is, that paradox I mentioned, again, doing that work, protecting political equality and those sets of rights, will yield an economic world where there is difference, will yield a social world where there's difference. And so we want to think about both of those other worlds by referring to this principle of difference without domination, okay? That then leads to some follow-on principles. A principle for how to think about the political realm, how to think about the social realm, how to think about the economic realm. Alrighty? So in the political realm, then we need institutions that deliver, it's a mouthful, but egalitarian constitutional participatory democracy. This is a pretty familiar concept with a little bit of a tweak. So we've had a constitutional democracy for a long time, but it hasn't always, in fact, done a great job of supporting the sharing of power among different parts of our society and community. So in my book, I try to articulate some reforms that we could move toward that would help us get to a place where our institutions are more fully supporting that practice of power sharing across the boundaries of different communities. Okay? I won't say more there for now. Connected society. Here, the idea is, in the kinds of policies that have an impact on our underlying social relationships, what we really need to do is foster as many bridging relationships across lines of difference as possible. That word, bridging relationships, comes from sociology, where sociologists often distinguish between bonding ties and bridging ties. Bonding ties are ties to people who are like ourselves. We share a religious background or a cultural background or an ethnic background or a neighborhood. Bridging ties are ties that link people across those kinds of lines of difference. It's very clear from a lot of empirical work in sociology that when societies create more bridging ties, they also see outcomes that are more egalitarian with regard to political practices, also the economy, and opportunity. Job opportunities flow in a more egalitarian way. Economic educational results improve across the board, and the like. So when you are thinking about how to support social relations that also support political equality, focusing on that work of generating bridging ties is really at the center of it. A polypolitan society. This is the most complicated one. And so I'm going to let you pause for a minute before we get to it. And I'm just going to let you take another look at the first one, the political principle. The principles of democratic institutions under this come partly from the Federalist Papers. Energy. Our institutions need to be effective and efficient. They need to deliver Republican safety. That means protecting those basic liberties. They also need to achieve accountability and that full inclusion. And that's the renovation, the innovation, okay, as we move into our own time. I'll come back to that. Connected society, to give you a sense of exactly what this is about. The concept of identity that's fluid and lets us connect in multiple ways to other people. Okay. And now let me also give you some concrete policies to make sense of each of these. This is a picture, obviously, of solar farms and wind farms. And this is a controversial policy area in the country. Many advocate for the expansion of our renewable energy infrastructure, and often the effort to move renewable infrastructure forward also encounters local resistance, communities resisting having wind farms or solar fields in their backyard. That resistance often emerges in the context of a variety of kinds of community meetings. And so this produces a concern among policymakers that there's a kind of trade-off between democracy, where people get to participate, and the energy or effectiveness of public policy, the desire to move renewable energy infrastructure forward quickly. So the question is, can you in fact come up with some alternative approaches that actually align inclusion and the work of asking people their opinion about things with effectiveness in policymaking? The landscape has some green shoots of possibility, a policy called community benefit agreements, where the actual financial benefit that flows from the production of renewable energy assets flows back to the communities that have the infrastructure sited in them. But to achieve those agreements, you actually have to have a negotiation process that brings the community into the negotiation process. The policy aligns the incentives of developers who are trying to build renewable energy infrastructure and communities who have to figure their way through the kind of costs and benefits of having this infrastructure in their community. Okay? So it's kind of a concrete example of what it means to try to bring the energy of democratic institutions and their inclusion together. Now, as to a connected society, let me give you a kind of concrete example of a policy there that starts to bring these ideas out. This is an urban planning design for a multimodal mixed-use community. And what that means is it is not zoned, as much of America is, for one or another kind of use. A lot of America is zoned just for single family, or just for multifamily, or just for commercial. Texas is actually probably the state that has done best at moving beyond single-use zoning to multimodal zoning. So in this picture, you can see some single-family residences towards the back, some duplexes, some commercial, some apartments over the commercial areas. This kind of, blowing up the kind of zoning framework, having a more open zoning structure, produces more bridging ties. More people from different kinds of backgrounds and contexts connect with each other, and that then is a driver of the positive outcomes of political participation, educational improvements, economic opportunity in the context. So I'm giving you these two examples because you'll notice the first one comes more from the left of the political spectrum, okay? That one, the community benefits agreements. This one comes more from the right of the political spectrum. So the point is that this framework, power-sharing liberalism, actually opens up the space of our reflection about the kinds of policies that make sense for us to pursue in our country. Okie doke. I'm sensitive to time, and I know I don't have that much time left, so I'm going to very briefly just share with you these last two ideas and then sum up so that we have time for questions and conversations. So, again, polypolitanism. It's a mouthful. I want to admit that, all right? But I also want to say it's no more of a mouthful than the word cosmopolitan, which is, after all, even the name of a magazine. So there's a future for this word, okay? So cosmopolitan came from the Greek, cosmos for world or globe, and polites for citizen, and it meant citizen of the globe, okay? And there are philosophers who call themselves cosmopolitans who have argued that instead of any of us thinking that we have a national identity, we should think of ourselves as just being citizens of the globe, and we should bring a humanitarian lens to all our considerations. Now, the counterpoint to that, of course, is that our most proximate connections are the ones we feel most strongly about: family, town, city, state, nation, right? Those matter to us. So the suggestion that I'm making is actually that we might instead recognize that we are in fact citizens of many contexts, poly meaning many. So it's a coinage from the Greek. And in fact, we are already all polypolitans, all right? So I'm a citizen of my city of Cambridge. I'm a citizen of Massachusetts. I'm a citizen of the United States. I'm also a member of the American Political Science Association. I've got some voting rights in the American Political Science Association. So there's an incredible array of things I am actually a member of in which I have voice and can contribute to shaping my society. Now, our immigration politics has gotten really caught on the idea that there's only one category of membership that matters: citizen of a nation, okay? And so we have a problem right now where there are huge flows of people around the world, and there will be for the foreseeable future because of the impacts of the structure of our economy, because of how technology is operating. And we are living in a world where people feel as if the choice is either you can support the movement of people and improve economic well-being for everybody by supporting the movement of people, or if you do that, you erode cultural cohesion in the given society. So the choice is you can either support the movement of people and support healthy economies, or support cultural cohesion. And the reason this feels like a dilemma is because movement is associated with precisely one and only one kind of membership in the nation state. Now, if we had a polypolitan framework for thinking about membership, it might be possible for us to think about many different ways in which people can be members of any given society. A ladder, yes, to full citizenship, but one doesn't necessarily need to think of citizenship as being the only thing that can structure immigration or migration into the country. And actually, I owe Claudio a lot for thinking about this subject. An example of how we already think this way is H-1B visas. Okay, where corporations and any hiring entity can sponsor migrants into the U.S. And those migrants have a formal role. They have an employment relationship. They've been sponsored in. They don't have citizenship. They have a path to citizenship depending on a lot of other things. We could massively expand this concept of sponsorship. Churches could sponsor people. Nonprofit organizations could sponsor people. And a practice of sponsorship means that people who enter that way also have voice through the organization that is sponsoring them. So they are not voiceless, they are not without political rights when they come into the country. And if you connect that to the idea of a ladder towards citizenship, you end up having more flexibility for how you think about structuring the different kinds of ways people can enter and become part of, for example, the US. Alrighty. Last idea is how to think about the economic realm in alignment with the principle of difference with domination. So this concept, this ideal, I refer to as the empowering economies ideal, and I really draw it from Marshall, who developed the Marshall Plan, George Marshall, for Europe. I'm going to go ahead and just read from here. In Marshall's announcement of the World War II Marshall Plan, he made the case that we needed an economy that works, that delivers growth and productivity, and stable transactions and prices, quote, so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist, okay? So the important point here is to see the economy as being for the free society, okay? We are not here for the economy. The economy is here for us. And so the question is, how do you develop and cultivate an economy that supports the conditions of participation broadly across the whole of society? There are small things that are part of this. So for example, currently we have a problem with wage theft in the country where people are not paid for work that they do. Wage theft, we thought we got rid of that basically at the end of the Civil War. Lincoln always made the case for a free labor economy, by which he didn't mean you wouldn't get paid. He meant free people labor and they earn wages, okay? Right now, we do not have a free labor economy in this country. So restoring a commitment to a free labor economy is an important thing to do, but also the way time works in our economy. Many people don't have time to participate in civic life. How do we achieve not just work-life balance, but work-life civic balance? Should employers give people the day off on election day, for instance? Okay, those are the kinds of questions that start to emerge into visibility. So I'm going to sum up by sharing this one thing that will be hard to read, and then one last thing, okay? So here's what I've been doing in this talk. When somebody talks about a paradigm, they're talking about a kind of mental model that you can use to organize your thinking. And in the terrain of political economy or theories of justice, paradigms consist of normative foundations, some core values that are your like North Stars, the things you're oriented toward, okay? Then there's an economic model that goes with those North Stars, some emblematic policies that capture them, and then some vernacular, some plain ways of speaking about these ideas. So if we take just the first row there, the classical liberal paradigm of political economy had the values of order and autonomy, movement away from paternalism and feudalism, things like that, and equal dignity. Those are some core values. It had an economic model focused on the division of labor, specialization in competitive markets, for example. Emblematic policies would have been anti-tariff or anti-monopoly policies. And then you'll recognize Adam Smith here. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest, right? Self-interest drives productivity, drives goods, material well-being for society. Or we take the bottom line, the sort of neoliberal paradigm. This is really the kind of economic model that has structured most of our policy making for the last 30, 40 years. The value there is really on negative freedom, those negative liberties, as I said, and on procedural justice. And the economic model is to see that self-interest and competitive markets are really powerful and sort of biggest drivers of good things. School vouchers are an example, or privatizing telecoms and utilities are good examples of emblematic policies. And some good examples of vernacular. Margaret Thatcher is there in the middle. There is no such thing as society, okay? Markets, but we're not going to be working on sort of civil society contributions to things. So I am not alone in trying to offer a new picture for how those pieces can fit together, but where the values start from social relations free from domination, equal dignity and voice, community and sustainability. There are some key aspects to the economic modeling. So the economists, for example, are working to model the place of power in principal-agent relationships, for example, in the labor market. Like, how does power actually affect dynamics in the labor market? That's just one example. There are a variety of different kinds of emblematic policies. I don't agree with all of the ones that are on here, for whatever that's worth. And then some key phrases is, real freedom for all. Both parts of freedom, right? Not just freedom of conscience, but also freedom to participate. Voice and choice. Libertarians fail at inequality, but statists fail at innovation. That one really calling out the need for markets, civil society, and public sector to work together in coordinated ways as teams in order to deliver solutions to public goods problems. Alrighty, that was a lot. I really thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
I'm curious about where campaign finance reform fits into this. I was kind of surprised that you didn't mention that, or maybe you didn't, I just didn't catch it. But it seems to me that the people with wealth have the greatest influence on who wins the presidency or senatorial elections. And how do we go about changing that?
No, thank you very much for your question. And I do often spend a lot of time just talking about the democracy part of the conversation. I obviously went well beyond that tonight. But you're right. I mean, I think there are a lot of reforms that we could work on to have a healthier democracy that's doing a better job of pulling people into full participation and giving our elected officials incentives to respond to the whole electorate, not just to those who have the deepest pockets or other kinds of influence. There are two reforms that I think would be really helpful right now to our politics. One is something called the For the People That's not right. I think it may be simply for the people amendment. I'll have to check, I apologize. So this is an amendment whose purpose is to add to the Constitution that free speech rights from the First Amendment apply only to natural persons, not to corporate persons. So it would take a constitutional amendment to undo Citizens United. So there's that, and there's a fantastic organization that is working on advancing that right now. So American Promise, it's called. You can look it up online. The second reform that I think is really helpful, which has been passed in Minnesota and Maine, is one that closes the loophole on foreign expenditure in our elections. So foreign expenditure in our elections is supposed to be illegal, but it actually happens through corporations right now, particularly multinational corporations. So the law is to prohibit election or ballot initiative expenditure from corporations if there's a higher than certain level foreign ownership of that company. So for example, Uber is currently spending a lot of money in American politics. They are very significantly owned by the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund. So that is the kind of relationship that these laws seek to undo. When people analyze what effect they would have on money in politics, those laws would take about 85% of corporate spending out of American politics. So not out of lobbying spending, though, which is the other big part of the conversation.
So we have another question right up here. Zach or Nina?
Thank you. This speaks to both polypolitanism and to the structure of an equal constitutional democracy. So what role would you see for citizen deliberative structures? There's been a lot of work in deliberative democracy by people like Fishkin and others talking sort of not about voting, but about other mechanisms by which people can engage in the policymaking process. Where do you see those fitting, if at all, into your notion of participation in the policymaking process? Is that part of these ideas? Thank you. Thank
you very much. Yes, it is part of these ideas, and I appreciate the opportunity to do a deeper dive, on the democracy question specifically. And we are living in a situation where the underlying demographic and socioeconomic facts of our constitutional democracy have changed tremendously, certainly over the last 50 years, but certainly also since the founding. So as we all know, right, our institutions were built for, relatively speaking, small agrarian society. They were also built for a society in which, Madison in Federal 10 makes the argument, people with extreme views will have trouble finding each other, like literally, because of the dispersal of the country, because of your rivers and mountains and so forth. And so, representation was supposed to work because there was a geography, was a forcing factor that required people to pass their views through representatives who would filter and moderate and mediate things. Now, obviously, right, those conditions don't pertain any longer. So there's a really important way in which really big technological demographic changes have changed the conditions for the operations of our institutions. And so even delivering on the original principles of our institutions requires renovating them. From my point of view, the use of jury-like mechanisms, deliberations, but on a bigger scale than a jury, can be embedded into our representative institutions. So a state house, for example, if it has a particularly thorny issue legislators have gotten stuck on, maybe it's polarized, you could add a citizens jury to provide advisory opinion on that with people selected by lot. The scales vary in terms of the size that they need to be to do this, but then they can sort of study up, and citizen juries functioning like that across a variety of contexts tend to produce less polarized answers to hard policy questions. And so then that can unlock the process that's gotten stuck. Also, then people feel more connected to the policymaking process. And getting rid of that experience of alienation and frustration that so many have right now is just really important. So yes, I think it's a really valuable idea.
Looks like we have one more question right up front. I think we can do one more. Great.
Sorry, I went way too
long. No, we're doing great.
Hello?
Okay, perfect.
So a lot of the issue with American democracy now is this idea of ruling and being ruled in turn, right? And it causes an issue of like undue democratic sacrifice within the nation now. So how does this idea of ruling and being ruled in turn incorporate into your philosophy here?
Well, first of all, I always love hearing Aristotle, so thank you for bringing Aristotle into the space. Can you do me a favor and say a little bit more about what you mean about the connection between, in what sense to you do you see ruling in turn producing undue sacrifice?
So what I mean by that is that for African Americans in particular, they have constantly, I guess, that's a strong word, but they've consistently not been fairly represented within government. They have not had their ruling chance. They've always been the be ruled aspect of that. And they've thus then had a lot of democratic sacrifice within their culture, right? Mm-hmm. So how does your method or how does your system prevent that?
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. So ruling and being ruled in turn is fundamentally what power sharing is about, okay? So your ears were well attuned to hear that connection to Aristotle. And yes, I mean, our democratic institutions have not achieved that full picture of power sharing in the country over time. So in a certain sense, the effort to find adjustments that support that is about moving past that pattern of undue sacrifice. So there are other provisions. So for example, I'm a supporter of same-day voter registration, which is doable with integrity in terms of IDs and so forth. And that's actually sort of paradox. If you do same-day voter registration, 22 states have same-day voter registration. When people register, they have to bring ID to register. So the paradox is sometimes people think that same-day voter registration would destabilize election integrity, but actually it introduces the use of IDs. All right, so it's actually a weird compromise kind of policy. Totally increases turnout, increases participation, increases access, particularly for lower income voters and communities of color. So that's that point of achieving full inclusion, and also, contributes to the sort of integrity questions. So that's one piece. I'm also an advocate, as I was sharing with the students earlier today, of getting rid of party primaries. 4 states have done that: Louisiana, California, Washington, and Alaska. And the reason to get rid of party primaries, which is not to say get rid of parties. Parties can still operate in a context without party primaries. But the reason to do that is to increase the degree of competitiveness in our elections and to open up the number of candidates, increase the range of candidates running for office. We need more candidates running. We need more people on the ballot in order to have a conversation that reflects the breadth of our society.
Great. Well, won't you join me in thanking Dr. Allen?